When people realize they can't control a sigma male, something subtle but powerful happens. Their behavior shifts.
They don't admit it, they don't announce it, but their patterns expose everything.
His silence, his independence, his refusal to be manipulated.
It all triggers reactions they never expected to reveal.
And the more he pulls his energy back, the more their true intentions surface. Desperation, insecurity, ego, or fear. What they fail to understand is simple. You cannot control someone who isn't seeking approval, validation, or permission in the first place. A sigma male becomes uncontrollable the moment he decides his peace matters more than anyone's expectations.
If you're ready to see these patterns clearly, type "uncaged" in the comments and tell me which behavior have you witnessed firsthand.
For more cinematic psychological insights, make sure you subscribe to Silent Wise. They start over-explaining themselves, trying to justify their behavior to regain influence over him.
When a sigma male stops responding to pressure, something shifts in the dynamic immediately. People who once felt confident in their influence suddenly find themselves scrambling for footing, and their first instinct is to over-explain. They pour out excuses, long stories, unnecessary details, not to bring clarity, but to rebuild the authority they can feel slipping away. His silence becomes a mirror, and in that mirror, they confront their own actions without the comfort of his usual emotional cushioning. The more he withdraws, the more they talk, hoping that words will patch the cracks forming between them. But every sentence they rush to justify only reveals how deeply they depended on his understanding to stay in control. As the sigma listens without reacting, their explanations become longer, more frantic, and more transparent. They sense that their usual tactics, charm, guilt, persuasion, no longer land, and it terrifies them. So they double down, offering rationalizations he never asked for, trying to shape the narrative before he silently decides where he stands. What they don't understand is that this rush to justify is the real confession. It shows him exactly where the manipulation was hiding, where the disrespect lived, or where the emotional imbalance began. He doesn't need to argue or interrogate. People reveal everything when they're afraid of losing influence over someone who no longer bends. Eventually, the over-explaining collapses into something quieter, a subtle panic beneath every sentence. They repeat themselves, trying to rewrite the past, trying to convince him of intentions he already sees through. While they talk, he studies patterns, not words. Their explanations become noise, and he recognizes the fear behind them, fear of losing someone they could not control. By the time they realize he hasn't said a word, the truth settles in. The sigma doesn't need explanations. He needed the clarity their desperation just provided. And once he has that clarity, the dynamic is permanently changed.
They escalate emotional tactics, guilt, pressure, or sudden concern, hoping to pull him back.
When a sigma male becomes unresponsive to subtle manipulation, people who once relied on emotional leverage begin to feel their grip slipping, and that's when the escalation begins. What starts as mild concern quickly morphs into heavier tactics, guilt-laced reminders, passive-aggressive comments, forced urgency, and exaggerated empathy. They throw emotional hooks in every direction, hoping one of them will catch. This shift isn't accidental, it's a survival instinct. When influence fails, pressure becomes the last resort. They try to trigger responsibility in him, attachment in him, or doubt in him, anything that might interrupt his quiet detachment. But he sees the pattern with surgical clarity, recognizing the emotional fog for what it truly is, desperation dressed as care. As the tactics intensify, their masks begin to crack. Guilt transforms into subtle blame. You've changed. I barely recognize you. I guess you don't care anymore. Lines designed to make him question himself.
Concern becomes intrusive. Sudden check-ins, unexpected kindness, exaggerated worry that feels more like surveillance than support.
Pressure becomes disguised as urgency,
We need to talk now. You can't just walk away. You owe me this conversation. Every emotional push reveals the truth they try to hide. They're not trying to reconnect with him. They're trying to regain control of a narrative he no longer participates in.
The Sigma listens but doesn't absorb.
He observes but doesn't engage.
And this neutrality drives them further into tactics they don't realize expose their intentions.
Eventually, their emotional moves begin to cannibalize themselves.
The harder they push, the calmer he becomes.
The more they escalate, the more distance he creates.
They throw everything into the air: affection, guilt, promises, pressure, hoping his emotional equilibrium will finally break.
But it never does.
Instead, their own instability becomes unmistakable, and he sees exactly what the connection was built on.
In that moment, the Sigma male understands the final truth. Anyone who must manipulate to keep him close was never meant to stay.
And when this realization settles, he doesn't argue, negotiate, or explain. He simply steps back, and every emotional tactic collapses under its own weight.
They shift to subtle manipulation, using silence, inconsistency, or withdrawal to provoke a reaction.
When direct emotional tactics fail, the next move is far quieter and far more calculated.
People who can't control a Sigma male begin to mimic his own strategies, hoping to turn his strength against him.
They stop talking, delay responses, disappear for hours or days, and resurface as if nothing happened.
This isn't real distance. It's a performance designed to destabilize him. They want him to wander.
They want him to chase.
They want the silence to sting.
But for a Sigma, these tactics don't create confusion, they create clarity. He doesn't interpret inconsistency as mystery, he interprets it as manipulation.
Silence, once a weapon of his own calm, now becomes a mirror that exposes their intentions with brutal honesty.
As inconsistency becomes their main tool, their behavior shifts into an unpredictable rhythm. Warm one moment, cold the next.
Interested today, indifferent tomorrow.
They sprinkle breadcrumbs of attention and then vanish, waiting to see if he follows.
Every action is designed to reopen the emotional loops he already closed. Withdrawal becomes a trap, a bait to test his patience, his attachment, his ego.
But Sigmas don't respond to emotional turbulence. They analyze it. He studies the timing, the contrast, the sudden gaps in connection.
And instead of leaning forward, he leans back.
The game they expect him to play becomes the proof he needed that the dynamic was never genuine.
When the manipulation reaches its peak, their silence grows louder than their words, but not in the way they intended. They expect him to chase the inconsistency, to question the withdrawal, to crave the return. Instead, he sees the pattern crystallize: control disguised as detachment, insecurity disguised as strategy. The more they pull away, the more he recognizes how little substance there was beneath the performance. And this realization doesn't make him angry, it makes him done. Where others would react, argue, or plead for clarity, the Sigma male simply closes the emotional door. Their silence doesn't provoke him, it liberates him. Their inconsistency doesn't hook him, it confirms his exit. Their withdrawal doesn't pull him closer, it pushes him into a peace they never expected him to choose.
They become competitive, trying to outperform him to feel powerful again.
When influence slips from their hands, the next instinct is competition.
Not the healthy, self-improving kind, but the performative, ego-driven scramble to re-establish dominance.
They begin comparing everything: achievements, attention, social reach, emotional impact. Suddenly, every conversation becomes a scoreboard, every interaction a silent contest. They talk louder, move faster, brag more openly, all in an attempt to reclaim a sense of superiority that his calm presence quietly stripped away. What unsettles them isn't that he's better, it's that he's unbothered. His lack of interest in competing becomes a threat because it reveals how attached they are to being seen, validated, admired.
The Sigma's indifference exposes their insecurity like a spotlight they never ask for. As this competitive energy grows, their behavior becomes unmistakably reactive. They mimic his strengths, adopt his approach, even mirror his silence, but their execution cracks under pressure.
They're performing confidence, not living it.
They chase achievements he never announced, respond to standards he never set, and measure themselves against someone who isn't playing the same game.
His stillness becomes their fuel. His quiet discipline becomes their obsession.
They try harder, push louder, and stretch themselves thin, hoping he will finally see them as superior, or at least acknowledge their effort.
But Sigmas don't grant validation on command.
Their self-worth is internal, not comparative. So, while others race to prove themselves, he remains steady, watching the emotional unraveling behind their competitive mask.
Eventually, this competition reveals more about them than it ever does about him.
The harder they try to outperform him, the more transparent their insecurity becomes.
Their desire to win exposes the fear of being overlooked, forgotten, or insignificant.
And the Sigma sees it all, not with judgment, but with detachment. He understands that anyone who competes with him isn't aligned with him.
He doesn't respond with rivalry, he responds with distance.
For him, competition is noise. And the louder they get, the more certain he becomes that stepping back is the only logical choice. Their attempt to regain power becomes the final confirmation that they never had any to begin with.
They test his boundaries repeatedly, hoping one crack will give them control.
When influence slips through their fingers, the next strategy is pressure, subtle at first, then deliberate.
They push against his limits to see if he'll bend. A small request disguised as harmless.
A comment meant to provoke.
A favor that drains more than it gives. Each test is a probe, a quiet attempt to map the edges of his self-respect. They assume everyone has a breaking point, a moment of weakness, an emotional seam that can be pried open.
But with a Sigma, boundaries aren't lines drawn in sand. They're steel walls forged through experience. Every time they press, he remains unmoved, responding with controlled stillness that unsettles them more than any confrontation ever could. His consistency becomes a mirror, reflecting back their desperation to regain footing they lost the moment he stopped being influential.
As they escalate, their tactics become transparent.
They criticize his silence to provoke explanation. They invade his space to force engagement.
They weaponize concern, guilt, or sudden affection to bypass his guard.
But nothing works. His boundary isn't a defensive shield, it's a filter, revealing in real time who respects his autonomy and who seeks to manipulate it. The more they push, the more he retreats into a quiet certainty that exposes their intentions. What they interpret as emotional distance is in reality evaluation. He's watching their patterns, assessing their motives, confirming whether they belong in his world or are simply demanding access to it. And with every failed attempt to control him, their frustration deepens because his stability dismantles their strategies one by one.
Eventually, the breaking point arrives, but not his. Theirs. They realize his boundaries aren't obstacles to overcome, but signals that he doesn't operate in their emotional economy. Their attempts to crack his guard reveal their own lack of self-control, their reliance on influence, and their fear of irrelevance. When they finally understand he won't bend, won't justify, won't surrender even an inch of his inner world, something shifts. They stop pushing, not out of respect, but because they've exhausted every tactic. And the Sigma walks away with quiet finality, leaving them with the truth they tried hardest to avoid. Control only works on those who need something, and he needs nothing from them.
They talk about him to others, trying to reshape the narrative since they can't shape him.
When they realize they can't influence him directly, the battlefield shifts from conversation to reputation.
Their words become weapons, and their audience becomes the new target. They begin rewriting him in the minds of others, not because he deserves critique, but because they've lost access to him.
This is the classic move of those who fear irrelevance. If they cannot control the man, they attempt to control the story surrounding him.
Whispers form first.
Misinterpretations wrapped as concern. Questions that are not questions, but seeds planted with intention. They speak confidently about the version of him they created in their frustration, hoping someone else will validate the narrative they can no longer impose on him. What they underestimate is the Sigma's indifference to social rewriting. He doesn't defend, correct, or chase clarity. His silence becomes louder than their attempts at distortion. And that silence unravels them. Without his reaction, their narrative loses fuel. They expected confrontation, explanation, or emotional recoil, something they could twist into evidence. Instead, they face an unmovable void. When the Sigma refuses to play the social game, their words begin to reflect more about themselves than about him. Observers start noticing the inconsistencies, the emotional undertones, the eagerness with which they speak about someone who has already stepped out of their orbit. Their effort becomes transparent. This isn't truth-sharing, it's ego repair. While they scramble to rewrite the story, he continues forward unaffected, creating a contrast that exposes their pettiness. The more they talk, the more obvious it becomes who is stuck in the past and who has outgrown the entire dynamic. Eventually, their narrative collapses under its own weight. You cannot manipulate a story about someone who lives outside the reach of social approval. His detachment makes their words irrelevant.
His evolution makes their version outdated.
And those watching quietly begin to shift their perception. A man uninterested in defending himself often appears far stronger than the ones who cannot stop discussing him.
In the end, their effort to reshape how others see him only reveals how unable they were to shape him at all, and how deeply it unsettles them to lose influence over someone who walks away without leaving a trace.
In the end, what unsettles people most is not the Sigma's silence, but the undeniable truth it exposes, that he cannot be controlled, redirected, or rewritten, no matter how loudly the world tries to narrate him. His power is not in confrontation, but in the calm certainty of someone who knows exactly who he is and refuses to waste a single breath defending it. If you're someone who resonates with this quiet strength, this strategic detachment, this instinct to evolve, even when no one understands it, then you're in the right place. Subscribe to Silent Wise and stay with us, because here we decode the mindsets, behaviors, and inner strategies of people who move differently, think deeper, and rise quietly above the noise.